Good morning, everyone, and to be able to talk to you this morning. As Cecilia said, my name is Stuart Walker, and I'm at Lancaster University in the UK. And I'm going to talk to you today about designing sustainability, which is the title of my forthcoming book, which will be available in May. Before I talk about this, I thought I'd just introduce you a little bit to Imagination Lancaster, which is the Design Research Centre. It used to be a lab, it's now a centre, just been made a research centre at Lancaster University. And to tell you a little bit about the context in which I'm working in the UK. So this is Lancaster. It's a very old city in the north of England. It looks around Midway, but most of this is Scotland up here. So it's the north of England, northwest of England. It's a very rainy place. It rains most days. But that's England, right? So we have a large castle in the middle. Lancaster, it comes from the ancient Roman. It was a Roman settlement. And the name of the river is the Lune. And it's a castle on the Lune. And from that we get Lancaster. So it's about 2.5 hours from London by train, and about 2 hours south of Edinburgh and Glasgow in Scotland. That's where it's positioned. More closely, it's an hour north of Manchester and Liverpool. And that area to the south was a key area during the Industrial Revolution in England from about 1750 to 1850. So historically, it's a very significant area in terms of the history of design and product design, because it was in this area that the factory system came into existence with the British cotton factories of the 17 and 1800s. And that was a huge social change in England, where instead of people working at home with craft-type cottage industries, we started the factory system, mainly in Manchester, and people started moving to the city, around the factory, so they had access to work. And so there was a huge social movement, massive urbanization. Within 10 years, the population of Manchester expanded 10 times within just 10 years. And Liverpool, which is very close to Manchester, was the main port for the British Empire at the time, which brought in a lot of the goods to Liverpool and then transported them up to Manchester for the weaving industry. Now that was associated with a lot of social deprivation, and if you saw the opening of the Olympics in London, you will have seen this, which was about the Industrial Revolution in the Manchester area, and it was famous for the factory system, but also writers. Charles Dickens, for example, during a tour of this area, wrote a book called Hard Times, published in 1854, which was the height of the British Industrial Revolution, which was about the social deprivation and the social inequities associated with that system of production. Because although there was lots of money produced, most of the people working in the factories were living in very poor conditions. These were the sort of factories. This mill is still in existence now as a museum. This was a weaving factory, cotton weaving. Most of the factories during the Industrial Revolution, the cotton mills, were spinning factories. Weaving came in later, and this was the setting of the recent movie The King's Speech. So that's just south of Lancaster. If we go the other way, just an hour north, we come to a very different place, almost the mirror image of what we have to the south. This is the British Lake District, the English Lake District, and this was the home not of industry and technology and rationality and instrumental thinking. It was the home of British Romanticism. So it's the mirror image, if you like, the flip side of what's going on in the south here. So this was the source of art, music, literature, aesthetics, and the human imagination, just to the north of us. And that place is famous for poetry, William Wordsworth, you see the date 1770 to 1850. So around the same time as the Industrial Revolution, he was talking about nature, the environment, spirituality. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who worked with William Wordsworth on the book Lyrical Ballads, was in the same time. Mary Shelley, who was the wife of the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, wrote at this time the book Frankenstein. Now, if you know Frankenstein, you probably know it from the movies where there's a big monster stumbling around. But if you read the book, it's a very different picture. It gives a very different story, and it really is a warning about science and technology and where it can lead if we have no values and meaning behind it. So it's about this monster we've created that we no longer can control, where science and technology go out of control because there's no grounding. We've lost the grounding of the values in what we're trying to do. So if you read the book, it's a different story from the Hollywood version. It's a very important book. If you haven't read it, I would recommend you do. It's very short. Turner, the painter. This is a painting of a very famous English painter. This is a painting of Morecambe Bay, which is right next to Lancaster city. And a bit later on, the critic John Ruskin, who's still very relevant to today in his critique of design and architecture and production. He was an inspiration behind people like Mahatma Gandhi and his social policies. So, if you put those two together, we have industry and technology and rationalism and instrumentalism, and we have aesthetics and imagination to the north. If you put those two together, that's another way of saying design, if you like. We have industry and technology, and we have aesthetics and the imagination. So it's both those things. It's not one or the other. When we think about design, it has to bring those two sides of ourselves, because these are reflections of different aspects of what it is to be a human being. So this is the city, this is the university, this is university student residences designed by, based on a system developed by Avi Friedman, Professor Avi Friedman at McGill University in Montreal. And this is a very eco type of building where the heat is recycled. It's timber frame, which is unusual for England. This is the Alexander Square, which is the center of the university. As you can see, it was built initially in the early 1960s, Lancaster University, and this was designed as the kind of town square of the university, where everybody goes through, and there's shops, the library is there, the banks, and so on. This is our building, Imagination Lancaster building. We're on this floor here, and down here. This is the Imagination Lab down here, where we do design work. There's a bridge over to it, there's a pond in front of it. It's an open and exploratory design-led research center. And we do teaching out of there. We have a Bachelor's of Science in Marketing and Design in conjunction with the management school. So it's split between design and management. And we've just started a design degree called Design Interactions, which has just been approved. And our longest running degree is the MA in Design Management, and we take about 30 students a year in Design Management. We also have a lot of PhD students. We've probably got about 70 PhD students within the centre at the moment, and they range from straight design PhD to what we call the CX PhD, the Creative Exchange PhD, which is a PhD in conjunction with industry. And we also have the Highwire PhD for the digital economy, innovation in the digital economy, which is a joint or an interdisciplinary PhD, which is quite unusual. It involves students and staff from design, from management and from computing, and it looks specifically at innovation for the digital economy. And we take about 10 PhD students a year into the Highwire program. In research, we have various areas of research within the centre: management, design features. One area which is called applied triviality, which is by a guy called Paul Colton, who looks at game design, but not in terms of entertainment, in terms of social innovation, and he calls that applied triviality. My area is design for sustainability, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll talk about my particular approach to design for sustainability. It's practice-based, practice-led, and in it I look at the emergence of unsustainability, why we're even talking about sustainability today, and the various meanings of sustainability, the values and priorities that come with this idea of sustainability, what it means in terms of our values and priorities, and the materials, processes and aesthetics of what we might call a sustainable material culture. Because clearly the material culture that we have created and designed over the 20th century is clearly not a sustainable material culture. So it's the materials use, the production processes, even the aesthetics are not the aesthetics of sustainability. They are the aesthetics of unsustainability. Because if we think of the aesthetics not as an applied style, but as the sensory experience of an object developed by a certain set of processes which are unsustainable, then they become the aesthetics of unsustainability. So, sustainability, we talk about it, but what do we think it is? Well, often, particularly if you ask people who are not studying sustainability, they usually say something like, it's something to do with the environment. And that's about as far as it goes. It's something to do, they don't really know what, but it's something to do with the environment. Even people in industry who have sustainability programs on their website, they say they're dealing with sustainability. If you ask them what it is, they usually, or often, they can't really explain that very clearly, but it's something to do with the environment. Or maybe it's something to do with climate change. Or maybe it's something to do with recycling. Maybe. Is it a goal? Is it something we can actually achieve? Should we be thinking of sustainability as a goal that can be achieved, and when we get there, then we're done, we're finished, we've got it, we've arrived at this thing we're calling sustainability? I think not, personally. I don't think it's something we can achieve in that kind of finite way. It's a word that we're using today to refer to something. I think maybe it's a word that we use to refer to a way of living in the world. Maybe a better way to put it again is a way of being in the world. A way that we think about our presence on the planet, and what we do, how we live, what we want, where we're going, and how sustainability frames that way of being in the world. What is our relationship to and within the world? How do we think about the world out there and ourselves in relation to it? So it questions a lot of the things of the modern condition. Materialism and individualism. Materialism both as a philosophy, the materialist philosophy that only the physical, tangible world is what exists and there is nothing else, but also the popular understanding of materialism where I want more stuff. And individualism, the idea that happiness is to be found through consumption. These are things which pervade our society, which pervade all our media, that you can buy happiness, you will be more fulfilled and more attractive if you buy more stuff. These are things which are very much to do with our way of being in the contemporary world, which we really need to challenge. So it's towards more a way of being in the world that is relational and interdependent, rather than atomistic and independent, where we recognize we are part of and reliant on a greater whole. And Cecilia and I were talking yesterday about this void, this hole in the middle of contemporary society, which has always accompanied the modern condition. Ever since the Enlightenment, there's been this hole in the center of society where God used to be. And when that died in our society, as Nietzsche said, there was a void, or a sense of meaninglessness. This void, which we try to fill today, and we are persuaded to fill today by consumption. Unfortunately, consumption does not fill it. So it's a way of being in the world that's in accord with individual needs. Yes, I am an individual. But also, I live with other people. We all live with other people, alongside other people. So we need to think about the needs of others and the notion of community. We're individuals, but we're also communal. And we need to think about the natural environment in which we live, because we depend on it, and actually we're part of it. So a sustainable way of being in the world has to give equal recognition to complementary aspects of the human condition, not just the one side. So, you will have probably seen this expressed in many different ways, left and right brain and so on, yin and yang. There are all sorts of ways of expressing this. But over the course of modernity, only one side of this has been emphasized to the detriment of the other. So this is the Manchester-Liverpool aspect, if you like, the instrumental, the rational, the productive side of us. And contemporary society prioritizes the rational, the objective and the evidential, evidence-based research. You hear it in universities all the time, evidence-based research. And it prioritizes that over the intuitive and the subjective and the experiential. So romanticism fades into the background compared with that industrialism to the south, if you like. But there are doubts today from philosophers, from all different types of people. There are doubts that physical facts, which is materialism, can account for human intention, human meaning, human purpose, and human value. We can have all the facts that we want, but we still can't account for these things. So a sustainable way of being is when theory and abstraction and generalization, which is this side, because we express this side in abstract terms, in formula, in language, in words, in drawings distanced from context. So we have to complement that with this other side, direct experience of the particularities of reality, direct experience of context, of people and materials and processes in the place that they are being dealt with, so that we see and we're very aware of the impacts and the consequences of our actions. Today, in today's production systems, where a product might be designed in California and produced in China with parts from Korea or Japan or somewhere else, we lose the context, we lose the particularities of place, and we lose the consequences. And nobody takes responsibility because everybody has one little piece of the puzzle. There's no overall responsibility for the whole thing. So we lose this holistic picture. By putting the two together, we gain a holistic picture of what it is we're doing. And this holistic outlook is fostered by things like solitude and contemplation and reflection. This is a fundamental part of the creative process and about thinking about meaning and purpose and intentionality and human values. We have to give time to these kinds of things, but increasingly that's difficult in the modern world. It's strongly related, these things are strongly related to human creativity, so they're very important for disciplines like design, because they're fundamental to the creative process. This was written in 1973, years before the internet and smartphones, which busy our lives and our brain. A non-creative environment is one that constantly bombards us with noise, with agitation and visual stimuli. A non-creative environment is one that constantly bombards us with noise, agitation and visual stimuli. I mean, this is very relevant for today with the internet, with smartphones, because we are constantly bombarded with noise, agitation and visual stimuli. Once we can detach ourselves from these distractions, the same environment becomes creative again. And that was written a long time ago now. So this holistic attitude and outlook is strongly related to spiritual well-being, because unless we give time for contemplation and reflection, we lose a sense of who we are and where we're going and what we value. And traditionally this has been expressed through religions, for example, which give the active and the contemplative, the physical and the metaphysical, the yin and the yang. So there's religions, philosophy, people like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, but also in environmentalism. You find these kinds of things in the writings of Aldo Leopold, in the Sand County Almanac, E.F. Schumacher in Small is Beautiful, and in Victor Papanek, Designed for the Real World and the Green Imperative. These spiritual, deeper, more profound aspects of what it is to be a human being is present in all these writings as fundamental aspects to the human condition, which in our distracted, busy world we seem to give less and less time to. And these things challenge many aspects of modern society that are socially divisive and socially inequitable and environmentally damaging. And they all hinder solitude, which is quietness of mind, contemplation and reflection. So many of these things about sustainability are at odds with the modern way we do things, with this constant sense of inundation by email, by Twitter, by text, by entertainment. We're entertaining ourselves to death, if you like. We're amusing ourselves to death. There's compulsive use behaviors, particularly with young people and smartphones. These are addictive technologies, there's no doubt. And at the same time, we're destroying the environment, and we have this sense of meaninglessness in our lives. And it's driven largely by consumer capitalism. Because it's in the interest of consumer capitalism to promote these things. Because if people aren't thinking and reflecting, they buy more stuff. That's why if you go into a store, a fashion store, there's always music thumping away in the background, because it helps distract you. It prevents you from thinking, and you sell more stuff. So this is I don't know if you know this book. It's a few years old now, by Peter Menzel, called Material World. It's a great book. He went around the world, you know it. He went around the world and he asked people in all different countries around the world just to take all their possessions, put them out in front of their house, and he took a picture. It was a very simple exercise. This is the United States, which is, of course, one of the most consumptive societies in the world. But sustainability challenges these assumptions and these attitudes, these behavioral norms, where this kind of acquisition is seen as a norm, and the ways of thinking behind it and the material expectations. So design has to be part of a systemic shift away from these levels of consumption, because they're destroying the planet and they don't make us happier. So for decades, design has contributed to unsustainable lifestyles by creating non-essential, short-lived objects of desire, so-called positional goods. And much of consumer society depends on this notion of positional goods, where it's not just the function, the utilitarian function of the object, it's the position it gives you in society. Because someone does not buy a Porsche sports car to go from A to B. There are other things at work here if you buy a Porsche, right? If you buy a diamond-studded Rolex watch, it's not about telling the time, it's about other things. These are positional goods which show your position in society. So design has to explore new directions and envision different ways of living that reflect different ways of being in the world. Business as usual is not creative, it's not sustainable, and it's not possible. Because if it really is unsustainable, then clearly we can't continue. So it needs to contextualize its current position, loosen its ties to corporate agendas, because if we're tied tightly to corporate agendas, we'll continue business as usual. It has to challenge its assumptions, challenge the assumptions which have been with design for 100 years or more. Contemporary design is a different form of design that was previous to the 20th century. It was designed for mass production in the 20th century. And we need to develop new values and new priorities. So contemporary design began at the start of the 20th century, at the dawn of mass production. And by 1910, most of the appliances, the household appliances that we now take for granted, they had been developed and were starting to go into production. So things like the telephone, the toaster, the radio, the electric iron, the electric vacuum cleaner, the electric kettle, all these electrical appliances, they were all in place, more or less, by 1910. Also by 1910, there were major developments in transport. The motor car had been developed, flight had been developed. So now it was just a case of improvement, but they were there by 1910. So the next phase, once you develop these goods, was to put them into mass production, so to gear them up for mass production, and its corollary, which is mass consumption. So once we developed these goods, we started this notion of consumer goods. And then designers were called in to differentiate one product from another on the store shelves, to increase the efficiency of production and to make it cheaper to produce. So in the US, design was driven mainly by commercial priorities and the market. They were the main drivers. So it was a very kind of commercial, business-oriented agenda in the United States. In Europe, it was somewhat different. It was driven more by intellectual and ideological considerations. There was more theory going on, more abstraction, if you like. And it was this European approach, and perhaps mainly the Bauhaus, which had major effects on design education in the 20th century and still has major effects. It still drives the agenda even today, the impact of the Bauhaus. And this, I would say, is fundamentally related to unsustainability. An original member of the Bauhaus was Johann Itten, who was something of a mystic and a colour theorist, and very much involved with craft production and hands-on. In 1923, he was sacked by Walter Gropius, which was the first phase of the Bauhaus, And Gropius brought in Laszlo Moholy-Nagy with a specific agenda to design for mass production and to set the traditional craft design in the background and focus more specifically on industry and design for mass production. Now that was a very significant decision, and it wasn't a decision in isolation, it was a decision which was part and parcel of the times, because there was this whole thrust during the first part of the 20th century towards the future, towards mechanization, towards efficiency, towards mass production, and the hope and the dreams of where this technology could lead us. It was done for the best of reasons, but nevertheless, in retrospect, this break, this cut with craft and spirituality and tradition, which perhaps was represented more by Johann Itten than by Moholy-Nagy, was a significant decision in the history of design, in setting the agenda for design during the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st century. It's still very strong in our design schools. And its legacy is inextricably linked to unsustainability, I would argue. But it was a human choice to take this route. And I think we always have to remember this. This was a human choice. We didn't have to go this route, we chose to go this route. And at the time, perhaps it seemed like the right decision. And it was very much, as I say, in the mood of the times. It was very much out with the old, in with the new, and history is bunk. Forget tradition, forget craft, that's old hat. We don't need it anymore. What we want is the future. So we had the Futurist Manifesto of 1909, the beauty of speed and mechanization and industry. It is all about looking forward. And what's the use of looking backward? This useless admiration of the past. We want to demolish museums and libraries. This was in the manifesto of Marinetti in the Futurism. Forget all that. Hundreds, thousands of years of human knowledge wrapped up in tradition and craft. Human wisdom, the source of human wisdom, was thrown out. And we look to the future and to what technology can offer. Surface decoration was rejected, which is very much part of 19th and 18th century design, understandings of what design was. Surface decoration was rejected. New materials were used for production of furniture and goods. Materials that had never been used before for the production of a chair. Tubular steel, for example, for the production of a chair. Before that, they were heavy, carved, ornate, turned wooden chairs and so on. So the result was a stark world of whites, chromes and primary colours. And here we have Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy from 1931, and here we have Richard Meyer's Barcelona MoMA 1995. And as you can see, the aesthetic from 1931 to 1900 is very similar through. So you can see the impact of this way of thinking that was developed, this international style, developed in the early part of the 20th century, continued to the late 20th century and into the 21st century. So these kinds of designs were a physical manifestation of this rejection of the past. The aesthetics of rejection, if you like. So its rationalized, unadorned forms created a false impression of independence from nature and the physical environment and context. This was the international style. Context was not so important. It was an international style designed for everywhere, or maybe designed for nowhere. And this sanitized style would have a lasting effect. And you can see it here. I mean, the Apple designs, led by Jonathan Ives, it's straight out of the Bauhaus. It's continuing today. And it set the seed, so the Bauhaus set the seeds for mass production, mass consumption, and the devastating effects of consumer capitalism. And again, it was a human choice to take this route. We didn't have to cut these ties to the past. We chose to do so. We thought they were no longer important to us. But a covenant had been broken. Long recognized wisdoms were now seen as irrelevant. We don't need them anymore. And it was a rupture that's having major consequences today. Because we are connected to nature. We should value community and interdependence. We are not autonomous, independent beings. We live in groups and we depend on the planet. So we need a new path for design is a path where we retrieve many of the things which were cast aside during the 20th century in its rush to progress. So we need to look again at craft and connection to the earth and connection to community and the importance of localization. At least we need to raise these questions today, because we realize if we didn't realize there was something wrong, we wouldn't have this word sustainability on the agenda today. It wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't be in our mind. And we must integrate these things with the benefits of technologies in ways that reduce consumerism. What a concept, reduce consumerism. Because all the thrust of today's society is to increase consumerism. We always want more. We want more profit, more production, more sales. But with that goes more materials use, more energy use, more gas emissions, more climate change, more waste production, more landfill, more pollution. All these things are associated with more consumerism. And we must integrate these with the benefits of technology in ways that allow designing, living and being sustainability. And that won't be an easy integration. It goes against the direction of modern society. Contemporary society has a bias towards innovation, and when we use the word innovation, we're talking about technology in today's society. Innovation can mean something new, something original, but in today's society, innovation means technology. That's what we're talking about. Progress means technology in today's society. Because you can sell technology, today is geared towards consumer capitalism. It's technological innovation and progress, and it's growth in the economy. And governments and universities are explicitly biased towards evidence-based research, and it's very difficult to give evidence about meaning and value, meanings and values, tacit knowledge, intuition, all these things which have been left out. You can't give evidence about those things. You can know it, but you can't show it. Evidence-based research, quantification and facts. This is what universities and governments want. So there's this bias in our society. And they're implicitly biased against experiential knowledge, tacit knowledge, intuition, and the human imagination. But as Einstein is attributed to have said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. So we tend to favor the physical over the metaphysical, and what is possible over what is moral. There have been 270,000 suicides by farmers since 1995 in India, which are linked to climate change, to GM and Terminator seeds, and to debt from chemical and pesticide use. And companies like Monsanto and others are implicated and associated with these kinds of developments. So these are the facts around these kinds of directions We go from sustainable, small-scale, context-based sustainable farming to dependency on chemicals and pesticides and terminator seeds. So you constantly have to buy the seeds every season, and the farmers get indebted, and they get to the point of despair, and they commit suicide. So designing sustainability demands new priorities, a retrieval of principles and values in public debate and in education. And the Mayor of London, I don't know if you saw it, Boris Johnson, he recently gave a talk where he basically said this. Wow. Just a week or two ago. It was essentially that message. Designing sustainability demands a reassessment of what is acceptable in contemporary society. Disposable packaging, single and limited use products, disposable phones. Our notion of what innovation is, and our notion of advancement. We really need to think about what these terms mean today. So designing sustainability demands less new product development. Less new product development. We must stop thinking, what can we design that will be new, that we can make money from? Because that's part of unsustainability. Less production, less advertising. Maybe an advertising tax. Skidelsky wrote a book last year called How Much Is Enough, where they question these things, and they're economists, and they suggested an advertising tax. So these are very challenging ideas about today's society, which is really throwing into question many of our assumptions about how we live, how we are in the world. So it means a systemic shift in our worldview, in our modes of education, in our economic system, and in our ways of doing business. A major shift in how we live in the world and our notion of being in the world. Cooperation, common goals, and spiritual renewal to give this sense of meaningfulness which was lost during the Enlightenment. So it means a more profound notion of what it is to be a human being, a community, and citizens on a finite and very fragile planet. So that's my understanding of what sustainability is. And it's through design that I explore what that might mean for material culture. So these are, I call them propositional objects. They are not commercial products. They are explorations in objects, in creating material artifacts which explore what the implications of sustainability might be for the way we think about our material culture. To explore that as an idea in the academic setting, not in the commercial setting. So it's a practice-based design research approach. Now typically, people quote this a lot, the triple bottom line of sustainability, which consists of economic viability, social justice, and environmental care. This was put forward by Elkington in 1997 in his book Cannibals with Forks. And it's been around now for quite a while, and it hasn't made too much difference, I would say. It's made some difference. But one of the problems with this is that the economic viability is put on equal terms with the other two, and in our society we always prioritize the economic. So if it's on equal terms, it tends to take over. So this is the triple bottom line: environment, nature and biodiversity, social, moral values, justice and equity, and development and growth of the economic. And sustainability should be here in the middle, where we put all those things together. But it's not comprehensive, it lacks relevance to the individual. All these are very large things: the economy, society, the environment. Where does it touch the individual person? And that's left it a bit problematic from the individual point of view, individual commitment, because they don't see themselves in this mix. And when we have a society and basically an economic monoculture, as Michaels calls it, in her book called Monoculture from 2011, she talks about that we live in an economic monoculture. This is the priority in contemporary society. So everything else gets seen through that lens. Medicine, education, social services, they're all dealt with in terms of economics rather than other priorities. So when we do that, this one comes to the fore, economic priorities come to the fore, and the social and the environmental consequences get pushed to the background, inevitably. And that maintains economic growth. This is not impacting, this is the same story as usual. The other thing we do in design is prioritize eco-technology solutions. So we have solar paneled everything and wind powered everything. But what that ends up with is new products, more consumption. Whereas what we want is less. We have to have less consumption. So if we produce a whole new bunch of eco products, and we throw out the old products and buy all the new eco products, and then in 2 years' time there'll be an improved, more efficient eco product, so we throw out that eco product and we buy another one. We're not changing the game, we're maintaining the game. So we produce all these things, solar powered cars and computers and chargers and lawnmowers and everything. And it maintains the current economic growth system. It doesn't disrupt. So governments love this, corporations love it, because it maintains the current system. It doesn't affect anything substantially. It's not systemic shift. So the problem with it, it's impersonal and utilitarian, and it's failed to spur effective change. It's made some changes. It was certainly a good proposition at the time, but since about 2000 on, we've seen that there's more involved than these three. So an increasing number of scholars contend that inner values and spirituality must be included in contemporary understandings of sustainability. So this applies not to society in general, but to the individual, the inner values of the individual conscience, and the individual notion of spiritual well-being, which can only be experienced as an individual. So the quadruple bottom line, which I put forward in my last book, The Spirit of Design, consists of 4 aspects, 3 of which take priority and 1 is secondary. So practical meaning, dealing with utilitarian needs and the environmental impacts of servicing those needs. So we need housing and warmth and shelter and practical goods, but we need to consider the acquisition of those, the production of those, in the context of the natural environment and their impacts on the natural environment. Social meaning, social justice, social equity, community and charity and compassion for the other. And personal meaning, spiritual well-being, inner values and personal conscience. They are the 3 main ones. And then in the background, pushed to the background, is economic, not meaning, but economic means. Because the economy should be seen as a means to an end. A means for achieving these other 3, not a priority in and of itself. It's the oil, the lubricant, that allows us to exchange services and goods in the world, but it shouldn't be an end in itself. So economic means, it's a means to an end, not an end in itself. So this is the quadruple bottom line. And again, sustainability occurs here when we put all these things together. They all need to be addressed together. So another way of expressing that is like this. This might be a better way of expressing it, because when we turn that on the side there, we can see that the practical utilitarian aspects of life, shelter and good practical goods and so on, and their environmental impacts. When we look at it in those terms, we have a very narrow perspective on the world. When we open it up and we get to the social and the impacts on community and social equity and social justice, we expand our view. And when we open it up again, we get a much more comprehensive view of ourselves in the world, our being in the world, if you like, where we take into consideration the left and the right, the rational and the intuitive, the instrumental and the subjective, the objective and the subjective. So it gives us a much fuller, more holistic view of ourselves in the world. So let's look at some of the objects that come out of this work. Object design and making to explore the nature of material culture in relation to sustainability. So by bringing this in, by bringing designing into the mix of the research, it allows in the creative, the intuitive, the tacit, the aesthetic, and to be part of the design research inquiry. If we're only inquiring in terms of quantitative or qualitative research agendas where we're coding and analysing and quantifying, well, you are using the left brain, the rationalistic, the abstract. When we bring in the design, the creative process, we bring in subjectivity, tacit, aesthetic experience, aesthetic judgment. We bring in all those things that are missed out by that more abstract, theoretical side. We bring in the contextual, the empirical, the experiential. So this is why I believe it's important to bring in creativity into the design research process. Now, and also, we often think of design as a problem-solving activity. But for this kind of design work, I don't think of it as a problem-solving activity, I think of it as a question-asking activity. How could design be? How could objects be if they are to be more sustainable? So here's an example. I'll just run through some examples. This is about improvisation and using what I have rather than what I want. A very quickly improvised notion of a chair. This is about reuse of packaging for the lamp. So bringing together mass-produced parts, off-the-shelf mass-produced parts, with locally produced parts together. This is minimizing materials. So taking, again, off-the-shelf lighting products, a bulb, a socket, a switch, and seeing what I can do to combine it with a minimum of additional materials to create a working lamp. So this is a small piece of material and some string. Local and mass production, so mass-produced objects combined with local production to create a new use. This was ad hoc design, so challenging our notions of aesthetics, creating a quickly whipped together application using recycled parts. So the deliberately ugly design, if you like, just to play with the idea of aesthetics and what kind of aesthetics would emerge without thinking about it as a conscious act. This was looking at putting together different recycled parts in an ensemble to create a new functionality. So this is a music player, but there's old TV legs, there's an old crate, there's some recycled electronic parts to create a new functionality. This was about technology change and aesthetic and form stability. So creating, the form remains the same, but the technology changes from analog battery to digital organic battery. It's a simple clock. It's the exercise which is important here. So the overall form stays the same, but the details change. So there's an aesthetic change, but that aesthetic change is based on a change in the technology. It's not just a styling change. Looking at ephemeral products, we often think about sustainable products as being long-lasting products. So I looked at ephemeral products, single-use products. So this is a potato and forks. They go back in the drawer. This goes into the compost. This burns down. So it's a single-use product. There's no evidence that it ever existed, with no impact. Here's a more elegant version. Similar here, you're just using off-the-shelf goods in a temporary arrangement. So these are kind of arrangements to produce a temporary functionality and after its use, when you don't want that product anymore, instead of going to landfill, it kind of gets reabsorbed into the built environment without ill effect. This was looking at taste, so again using recycled parts and off-the-shelf parts to create a wall light. I've created two of these in different styles. One is as sustainable as the other, so I wanted to sort of convey the idea that this isn't the aesthetics of sustainability, this sort of Bauhaus clean primary colour style, because this is just as sustainable in a very different aesthetic. Here's a similar set using the idea of the frame. The challenge here was, how do you take an old, unwanted consumer product like a cassette player? It's old technology, nobody wants it anymore, we throw them out. But what that consists of is a couple of speakers with some controls and an amplifier and a cassette. The only thing that changes really is the source of the music, so whether it's CD or whether it's MP3. But then so we throw this out, and then we go out and we buy an amplifier and speakers to plug our iPhone into. So we're basically throwing out what we're going out to buy. So how do we recontextualize this old technology? But the important thing, not taking it apart, not making it into something new, using it as it is. Because to take it apart is very expensive, a lot of labor involved to convert it. How do you use it as it is, but recontextualize it so it isn't seen as an old object? And the experiment I was using here was to give it its own context, this frame linked up to an MP3 player, so it becomes a component within a larger composition. And thereby we don't see it so much as an old object. If that was just sitting on a table in a modern house, it would look like an old object. In the frame, it's part of a larger composition. Here's another one using wood grain and flowery wallpaper. Similar kind of thing. But again, this framing device allows you to see it in a new way. And this was just a composition of two old products. Similar kind of idea. This was an experiment, if you like, to look at mobile phones. And there are millions of these things thrown out every year. So the idea here was to challenge some of the assumptions about mobile phones. Convenience, for example, but it's that convenience which promotes a kind of an addictive quality. You know, I could be talking to you, it could go off, I'll look at it as, oh, excuse me, I've just got to take this call, even though I'm in the middle of the presentation. I've seen it done, actually. I've seen it done. So we go from fixed commodity to a provisional, continually upgradable artifact. What do I mean by that? We think of a mobile phone as a fixed thing, which we use for a while until the technology becomes improved. Then we throw it away and we buy a new one. And it's a fixed technology for a finite period of time. So challenging that, and challenging convenience and impulsive use, where the technology basically controls you, to focused attention and considered use, where you control the technology. So this is what's inside the pouch. It's a potential mobile phone. It's not a mobile phone yet. You have to put it together very quickly, but then it becomes a phone, and you can check your messages, make your calls, check your texts, and you check it, and it's considered use. You pay it attention when you choose to pay it attention, and then you take it apart and put it away, and it will no longer interrupt you. You are in control of the technology. Now, admittedly, that's very inconvenient, but that's the point. That's the point. So this is the most upgradable. Why is it the most upgradable? Because within that fabric pouch, there's no constraints on the volume. You could have a much larger screen or bigger, thicker battery. If you enclose it within a tight rectangle, then there are constraints on the volume, but you can't predict what technology is coming around the corner. So that's the most flexible. This is a little less flexible, but more convenient. This is less upgradable. It's still upgradable, but it allows for impulsive use, and this is not upgradable. This is a regular phone. For this one, which is the most upgradable and the most inconvenient, the most considered use, if you like, you're in control. over a period of time where you might throw out and replace 9 mobile phones, here you replace equivalent of 1.5 to 2 mobile phones in parts, which because they're parts, they can be recycled more easily rather than a whole phone. And when you consider there's 400 million of these discarded each year, this represents an 80% reduction in e-waste. Now when you apply that to PCs, laptops, tablets and all the other technologies, that kind of approach is far less wasteful in terms of e-waste, which is a major problem. Here's another example of a simple floor lamp. On the right hand side, these are all the off-the-shelf parts that are required to produce the light. On the left hand side, these are all the parts that I've added to turn those parts into a usable product, into a usable lamp. All these parts are completely natural and they can be returned to the natural environment after their use. So we can, the technological parts are simply draped over the design components so they can be easily separated. Because these are off the shelf, they're not designed for this specific product, at the end of its useful life, these parts can be very easily reused. These parts can be returned to the natural environment without any ill effect. So there's no detrimental waste, if you like. So we can use those parts with a scroll of paper to create a new product, the same parts. So so it eliminates a lot of the negative waste associated with these kinds of products. Here's a desktop version using an LED. It's just a stone and a piece of bamboo. This one is an example. This is an important object from my own research point of view because I did it completely intuitively without really knowing what I was doing, and it was only after the fact, and I reflected on it, I talked about reflection and contemplation after, that I realized what this was about. This is called post-design rationalization, which I'm a big fan of. We often regard post-design rationalization in negative terms in design studio, but often when you're doing something, when you're involved in the process, it feels right, you're doing it intuitively, subjectively, you're getting a response back from the materials, and it's only after the fact when you stand back and you reflect on it that you understand what that's really about. So this is an electronic thing, and it doesn't really matter what it is. It happens to be an electronic metronome, which is driven by a disposable battery. But it's representative of electronic products which fill our lives these days. And the disposable battery, which is toxic, which ends up in landfill and is toxic, it can leach into the water supply, we use these things without thinking. So this is exposed here, this is shown, this is part of the aesthetics of this design. We're not hiding it in a casing, we're saying that's what we're using. And if you've got a problem with that, then let's talk about it and let's change it. But don't let's hide it and pretend it doesn't exist. And it's bound, the electronics and the disposable battery are literally bound to a natural element. Because both come from the natural environment. The battery and the circuit come from the natural environment just as much as the stone, and they end up back in the natural environment. So this is an expression of that relationship, of this relationship between what we produce and the natural environment, from where it comes and to where it goes. Here's some other examples. This is a doorbell. This is a radio. They're examples of the same kind of idea, exploring the same idea. So we're moving from symbolic and non-symbolic, thinking about symbolism and form beyond function. So symbolic meaning and symbolic aesthetics beyond the Bauhaus form follows function mantra, sort of probing what that might mean today. So here's one of the first, all these next set of products or objects are about human memory and symbolism. So they've got electronic memory embedded in them in some way, but they've also got other symbols about the human form, about recycled, reused products, about the label. The label is very important in our society. It's the brand, it's the barcode, it's the price. It's all sorts of things, the label. It's a very important element in modern society. This is another one where I'm mixing up human memory in terms of digital memory with ideas of spirituality and symbolism and coin and these different symbols that bring meaning to our lives. This is about cottage industry. Remember when I said in Manchester, the factory system, there was a social change away from cottage crafts and cottage industry where people did their work in their home to the factory system where they moved to the city to do their work. Well, this is about knitting and patchwork and sewing and these traditional cottage crafts. It's a reflection on those kinds of things, and again it's got a digital memory inside it. This one's called Icon, which is a deliberate reference to the religious icon with some symbolism which I won't go into now, with a hard drive. Similar kind of thing with different memory chips, electronic memory chips in here. So now moving from propositional objects to contemplative objects. So these are not even attempting to be functional in the normal sense. These are more products or objects to think about objects. So they are contemplative objects where we reflect on the nature of objects, if you like. So these are objects for inner work, for spiritual well-being and reflection, rather than outer function and utility. So they're about inner work rather than outer work, if you like, if you want to put it that way. So utility is set aside, and they refer to these first ones refer to a specific spiritual tradition, because normally the language of spirituality is associated with a particular tradition, until recent times anyway. And so these are associated with the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is my spiritual tradition in Western culture. This one's called Cana, which is a reference to one of the stories in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John. This is called Stone, Water and Wine, and it refers to the first miracle of Jesus in the Gospel of John. But it's expressed in the language of science, in the scientific language of contemporary society, rather than in traditional religious expression. Here's another one called Babel, which is a reference to the Tower of Babel story, and the inner meaning behind these stories, the spiritual meaning, the metaphorical meaning, if you like, behind these stories. So this is the Old Testament, this is the New Testament, and this is from Wittgenstein about things, those inner things, whereof one cannot speak explicitly. We can't explain it explicitly. So this one remains blank. And now we're moving from design objects to objects about design objects, using the similar kind of means. Now, this was, how do I create an object to reflect on contemporary consumer products? And I thought about this for a while. If I take a contemporary consumer product like an iPhone, for example, it's very difficult to reflect on that object because it's so loaded with values and advertising and marketing and preconceptions that it's a cool object. And it's the same with all these different consumer products. If they're brand new, they look really cool, and so we want them. If we take an old object, an old phone, or an old music player, it's old technology, and people are not interested in talking about it because we're geared towards wanting the latest. So this a cassette player or something like that, nobody's interested in talking about that now because the latest thing is something else. So how do we talk about these objects? What objects can we talk about from contemporary society which don't have this coolness or that doesn't have this sort of out-of-dateness which is associated with recent objects which aren't the latest technology? So what I decided to do was to look at secondary objects. that go with these latest technologies, these latest objects. They're the secondary objects which accompany them, which we don't want to have to buy or deal with, but nevertheless we have to have in order to use these latest objects. So here's an example. This one's called Land, and this is ink cartridges from printers. Now we don't want ink cartridges, we don't desire ink cartridges, but nevertheless we need ink cartridges to run our printer, which is the object we do want, so we can print our stuff. But nevertheless, these mixed materials ink cartridges end up in landfill with toxic chemicals in the inks very often. This one's called Water, which is disposable batteries, stripped of their branding. And this one is a recharger for iPhone, for mobile phones, which if you think of as a little CO2 pump, you can think of it in terms of air quality. Every time we plug it in, we're plugging in a little CO2 pump, if you like. So all these things have effects: land, water and air. So this is a way of reflecting on our contemporary objects without focusing on the primary object itself. Continuing objects for inner work, objects that transcend any spiritual tradition. The earlier objects I showed you, Babel and Cana, were about the Judeo-Christian tradition. So I tried to do an object which transcended all religious traditions, but were maybe common to them all. And this is called Oriel Triptych, or window, and it's based on the idea of a door to the spiritual world, if you like, which is common, a gateway, a narrow door, a narrow gate. It's common in many, many spiritual traditions. It's present in Christianity, in Islam, the Torii gate in Shinto in Japan, in Buddhism. All the major religions talk about this idea of a gate. So this is a triptych, which is a traditional sort of religious form, but it's not specific to any one religion or any one spiritual tradition. And then going even beyond that now, going beyond any particular symbolic form, going beyond concept, human concept, and going beyond any particular religion, and going beyond even made objects. So this is now, the next object is a focus for reflection, for contemplation, for solitude, those things I talked about at the beginning, but without any human concepts, without any human manufacturing, and it's just a simple stone, which many authors have talked about, a simple pebble. Ruskin talked about this, and what this represents, what this symbolizes in terms of time, in terms of nature, and it just serves as a focus for human reflection and contemplation. But it's beyond human concept. It's associated, it was inspired too by John Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds, which is a musical composition, which is 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence. So it's, which again was beyond human concepts. He wasn't layering on human concepts onto the idea. He was allowing it to be what it is. So coming back now, finally, what does all this mean in terms of functional objects for human use? This last object then is coming back to that functional object. So going from objects from inner work to objects of functional use, but minimalizing the imposition and the impact, and comparing it to what went before, so we can see the difference. So this is a chess set. I call it the Balanus Chess Set. It's very simple. It's made from green wood. It's made from branches which have been blown down. I didn't cut them. They've been blown down in a storm. It's made from the holm oak, which is a particular type of evergreen oak tree. And Balanus is the nymph of the holm oak from Greek mythology. So there's mythology involved in it. And the bands are made from flax, which is a completely natural object. So each piece is defined by one cut of the saw, and it's hand cut. So some of the objects are a bit wobbly. You can see this one's not standing up quite straight. That's part of it. It's not measured. It's deliberately not measured, and it's not machine cut. It's all hand cut with a minimal process for defining each piece. One cut for each piece to define the piece. Now when we compare this to previous chess sets, this is the Staunton Chess Set from 1849, and you can see certain similarities. Here you've got a hierarchy. The king is the largest piece, then the queen, and then there's a descending hierarchy down to the pawn. So it maintains that hierarchy, which is the traditional hierarchy from the tradition of where chess comes from. The king at the top and the regular soldiers at the bottom of the hierarchy, if you like. So it references that hierarchy. Apart from that, there's much less processing and much less waste. This is turned, this is just cut. If we compare it with the Bauhaus chess set, you'll see a very marked difference. I don't know if you know this. This was designed by Joseph Hartwig in 1923-24, and it's a very good example of form follows function. The traditional hierarchy is thrown out. All that tradition is gone. These pieces are defined purely in terms of form follows function. So the bishop, for example, moves diagonally across the chessboard, and so it's defined as a cross. The knight moves in an L shape, and so it's defined as an L. So all the tradition and the hierarchy and the history and the meaning, the cultural meaning behind chess is thrown out, and we bring in a form which is form follows function. Purely utilitarian. So so when we compare this chess set with this chess set, it's a move from this Bauhaus approach to design, form follows function, utilitarian, to bringing in other values, the natural environment, mythology and meaning and values and culture and history. That was the attempt anyway, so that's the Balanus Chess Set in a very simple form. So when we look at this in reflection, just to finish off, we go from sustainability within a conventional frame, this is very much kind of Bauhaus type style design, to objects that emerge from place, where the wood and the stone is very much about context and place. The silk here is a reference to the silk industry, which at one time was very important in the Lancaster economy. To technology and symbolism and surface decoration, which was thrown out in the Bauhaus period, to contemplative objects about inner work rather than outer utility. So they all stand outside modern instrumentalism and rationalized mass production. They're all to do with place, to do with hand making, craft, tradition, history, culture, context, people. And the human imagination and tradition and concerns that transcend materialism, resulting, I would argue, in a more holistic design approach that takes into consideration the left and the right, the industry and the romanticism. What we can do to a wisdom economy based on what we should do. And when we move from can to should, we move from possibility to moral obligation. We bring in ethics and human values and priorities, and to think about purpose and human intention and all those things which have been missed out of the research and the progress of modernity, which have to be put back into the mix. So if you're interested in these things, these are my books. This is the latest book coming out in May 2014, Designing Sustainability. This came out this year, the Handbook of Design for Sustainability, and Cecilia has a chapter in that book as well. So thank you very much for your attention.
So I acknowledge the students and especially your wonderful talk. and maybe we could have a debate of some points.
Of course.
But I don't know, maybe it's also we need a break of 15 minutes or 10 minutes, then we come back.
If you like, or we could take a few questions now and then take a break. Maybe that would be better.
Prefer,
I think so.
Maybe, ok. So, então a gente vai ter questões e perguntas logo diretamente, depois a gente faz o intervalo, tá bom?
I'm happy to take questions or comments or any thoughts you might have.
Eu gostaria só de, I would like just to recall that the pieces that you presented are your pieces.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, os objetos que ele apresentou foram objetos que ele criou e eu acho extremamente importante no contexto dos debates que nós tivemos sobre sustentabilidade, poder, de alguma maneira, entender o trabalho do professor não só na vertente teórica, mas também no output, na produção. So, I said to them that it's very important to understand your work not only from theoretician perspective, theoretical perspective as a theoretician, but also as an artist and a designer. And that is quite important because this is part of design background.
That's right. I mean, they're completely integrated.
Yes.
There's no separation. And I was going to give, if students can come tomorrow, and I'm going to be talking about Imagination's Promise, the chapter in the book, I'll be talking about the process in more detail and the relationship between theory and practice in more detail, which I didn't have time to do today.
Nós temos uma proposta, né, de que se vocês puderem efetivamente vir amanhã, essa sala está reservada e aí ele vai fazer um workshop prático com vocês na produção de alguns projetos. Né? Eu acho que seria maravilhoso se realmente a gente pudesse ter esse workshop amanhã, mas nós vamos conversar sobre isso agora. Agora, o que é fundamental, que nós discutimos, sorry, I'm speaking in Portuguese.
No,
but
don't apologize for speaking in your language.
I will translate for you. Mas o que eu considero extremamente importante para os alunos é que nós discutimos durante todo o semestre a relação entre o pensar e o projetar, entre o pensar e o fazer. Isso foi um tema que nós discutimos profundamente e, aliás, o tema que o professor trata em toda a palestra dele é um tema que vocês estudaram através do texto do Luiz Magalhães, que é a presença da intuição no design e na construção de currículos em design. So this was a very important issue that we have been discussing during our course. First of all, the relationship between thinking and doing and designing. That is a very relevant issue for all these students, and also a Brazilian author that I can introduce to you is Aloysio Magalhães. He was professor at the very first Brazilian design school, and he acknowledged intuition in his piece, and that is quite important to discuss and to debate with our students.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Então, as questões estão abertas. Eu gostaria que, por favor, please go ahead and ask.
Yes.
Bia, está sendo gravado, então, por favor, venha aqui na frente, porque a câmera pega.
Okay, my name is Beatriz. My question for you is regarding how to involve the other actors on this powerful system, because, for example, I can be a designer more conscient, but how to be economic conscious person in the system in higher level of the power system.
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me address that question in a particular way. You'll see that most of the work, virtually all the work I do here and that I've shown in the design work, I do alone. I do as an individual design researcher. And there's a reason for that. I think very often in design in academia, because it's kind of a practical subject, we expect it to have a practical application immediately. But what we are going through in modern society is a major shift. And so it's time, it's an appropriate time to step back from that immediate practical application and to think and contemplate and explore how design could be if it's not like it has been. What other directions are there? Now, we don't have all the answers for that. We're at the point in our development where we're exploring new directions. We don't know if they're going to be practical or economic. We haven't figured out all the different angles. But it's up to everybody in society, designers included, to explore what their discipline means in terms of sustainability. And then when we've explored that within our own discipline a bit, we can start joining it up with other disciplines and thinking, well, what does this mean if we were going to create a small enterprise that's going to be economically viable, that's going to be sustainable, that's going to be good for exploring design and be good for people, consumers. We can start putting those things together, but the first thing in design is to understand where what direction design needs to be headed so that we're on a firm footing. And that's what this work represents. It's not immediately applicable in the marketplace. It's not immediately competitive with existing approaches to design. It's stepping back from that within the environment of the academy, excuse me, I'm tripping over my words, to explore what the meaning is for design in the future. Because the 20th century design and the direction it's taken over the last 100 years is a very powerful model that has been very successful in a particular way. And we have to change now and explore a different direction which brings in many ingredients which that direction design left out. And it's clear that approach to design is unsustainable. So how do we bring in these other things? And what would material culture be like when we start doing that? But you know, when the Bauhaus started and exploring, it was very much exploratory. It wasn't designed for immediate production. That came later, some years later, that stuff went into production. And so this is the stage we're at now, I think, in early 21st century design, to really explore the meanings of design for sustainability and the direction it should be going. And then we can bring in the other aspects at some point. But I'm not sure we've really explored yet enough about where design should be going. There has been a lot of emphasis on service design and things like that, which brings in, you know, other actors and designing services for sustainability. But there's been less emphasis, I would say, on product design for sustainability in a more comprehensive way. And there's been a lot of emphasis on recycling and technology innovation, like I've talked about, but less emphasis on a fuller picture of what design for sustainability means to product design for sustainability. So while service design, you know, is an important area, the solid waste, the energy use, the climate change emissions and so on are very much associated with product design. But in Europe, certainly, much of the production has moved to China, and so much of the emphasis on design in Europe has moved towards service design. But it doesn't mean we're free of products, it just means that we don't build them anymore. They're made in China. But we're still dependent on them, we still throw them away, so we still need to consider their design. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's the way I come at it.
Stuart, I have a comment on this topic. So I think that when you talk about design in the future, I think we now That's the point, you know, and it has to do with something that you stressed during your presentation, that is integrating the idea of consequence of a certain design.
Yes.
And thinking in this direction, I think we already spoke this morning about the role of education.
Yes.
And the role of curriculum development in the direction of designing future.
Yes.
So that for me is a crucial aspect that we are facing today.
It's absolutely crucial. And I think design it's a relatively new player in Europe, anyway, certainly in Britain, a relatively new player in universities. It used to be in the art and design colleges where there was no particular requirement for research, so it's relatively recent. And there has been, I believe, something of an acceptance of ways of assessing design which tend more towards science and engineering criteria for design. So instrumental, functionality, materials-based, quantitative methods, that kind of stuff. But I think we need to have more confidence in our discipline and say, actually, tacit knowledge, intuition, subjectivity, aesthetic judgment are fundamental to the discipline. And we're not ashamed of it. We're not trying to pretend they don't exist. They are fundamental to the discipline, and that's how we should assess it. That's how we should critique it. And and we should be up to that challenge of critique. But it's not appropriate for people who are not part of that discipline to be critiquing that in a way, because, you know, I wouldn't critique somebody's work in brain surgery because I don't know the subject. We have to be confident that there is a discipline called design, and it involves rational instrumentalism, functionality and so on, but also intuition, tacit knowledge and aesthetic judgment, and that's fundamental to the creative process. And I'm there's a lot of talk these days about design thinking and design thinking, applying design thinking in business schools and so on. You see a lot about it. I have a real problem with that, you know, because as I will talk tomorrow, design is not thinking, design is thinking and doing.
Yes.
It's the two together. So if you separate out the design thinking, you're dealing with it in terms of left brain, abstract, rational terms. You're not dealing with it in terms of tacit knowledge, intuition, aesthetic judgment. So we should not be talking about, in my view, design thinking. We should be talking about design, thinking and doing.
So going back to education, it's very important, the link that you showed us about the relationship between Bauhaus and modernism and sustainability.
Yes.
So now we are exactly in a transition point where we are rethinking the legacy of Bauhaus.
That's right.
So in this transition point, again, is the strong role of education.
Absolutely.
And how to design curriculum that will embrace this tacit knowledge.
That's right.
And just a last comment. What, according to you, I think this is your third visit to Brazil?
Yes, third visit to Brazil, second visit to USP.
Yes, second visit at USP and the third visit to Brazil.
Yeah.
What is, according to you, the role of Brazil and Latin America in this context of this new approach? I mean, the integration of tacit knowledge and of these new aesthetics that you presented.
Yeah.
This is according to your two experiences at USP and 3 visits to Brazil, considering northern eastern part that you visited Recife.
Well, before I answer that question, I'd just like to say that I think I am not, and I don't want it to come across that I'm criticizing the Bauhaus here, because they were responding to the challenges of their time.
Yes.
So it's not a case of me criticizing the Bauhaus and saying what they did was wrong. They were responding appropriately with best intentions to the challenges of their time. 100 years later, we've seen some problems emerge from that approach. Now we are faced with similar challenges to respond to the challenges of our time. They are different challenges. After a century of mass production, we face new challenges and we need to adjust and change, just as they had to with the development of new technologies for mass production. So we face new challenges. We can't stay the same. Now that creates a lot of challenges. It creates a lot of opportunities. Now, coming back to your question about Brazil, Brazil is a rapidly developing economy with lots of new opportunities for development and change. So my perception is, and I apologize for speaking in ignorance here because I don't know the country intimately, but it seems to me that in a developing economy, there are two main ways the economy and the development can go. One can be to copy what we've done in North America and Europe and to make all those same mistakes and in a certain amount of time realize that we've got to deal with those same problems that we are dealing with and have dealt with. Or we can say, no, we're going to leapfrog that. We're not going to just accept this because it's the ways that have been shown in Europe and North America. We're not going to accept it. We're going to explore new ways forward, which benefit from some of those developments, but also look at them critically and say, these aren't all the answers. They're not all the answers in terms of sustainability, but they're not all the answers in the context of Brazil. Because Brazil and that's one of the challenges of sustainability. It's not one size fits all. It's not international design. It's context specific. So what are the particular challenges of context? What is the environment like? What are the resources like? What are the traditional cultural mores and the traditional crafts that can be used to develop products which are appropriate to place? Not just to, import stuff and export raw materials, which unfortunately, in a lot of developing economies, that's what they are. They export raw materials at low cost and import consumer goods at high cost and get into debt. So, that's not a sustainable way forward. It's to be sensitive to the people and the culture and the traditions and the crafts, and sensitive to place and the natural environment, and to develop your own way forward based on those resources.
Tem mais questões?
I was thinking about recycling. You didn't talk about it. It's part of the equation in design.
Say again, I didn't hear the word.
Será que você poderia...
Society.
Por favor, você poderia ficar em pé e falar seu nome, porque está sendo gravado? Talvez se você pudesse vir aqui seria melhor.
You're thinking about society?
Hold on just a second. She will come. She will... Vem aqui na frente.
What was it?
She will come. She will come because they are recording.
Okay.
Fala seu nome.
My name is Gabriela. I'm a friend of the...
Come here so the camera can see you. Got to look at the camera.
My name is Gabriela. I'm a friend of a student, and she invited me.
Great.
I'm a designer too, but I'm not in a course. I was thinking about recycling.
Recycling.
If we can put this in the equation of when we are thinking in sustainable design, how this could be or should be included.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, yeah, recycling. Well, it's obviously an important issue, and there's different ways we can think about recycling. We can recycle. I mean, I showed you some examples here with the candlestick with the potato. We can recycle that back into the compost, for example, as a natural substance. With the floor lamp made out of natural materials and off-the-shelf materials, the natural materials can be put back into nature without any ill effect. Now, is that recycling? its replacement back into the natural environment where it can break down and maybe feed compost somewhere. The technological components can be reused into a new product, a different product. They can have another application. So that's reuse rather than recycling. But if we can design for reuse, then it's better than recycling, I would say, because you don't have to use more energy, you don't have to grind it down and turn it back into raw material, you're not mixing up materials, you're reusing it as it is, more or less, in a new application. So reuse is better than recycling. Recycling is further down the road, I think. If we produce lots of disposable products that create lots of solid waste, then it makes sense to recycle it if there's nothing else we can do with it. So the first thing to ask is, do we really need all these disposable products? Or is there a better way? Do we really have to have disposable bottles, glass bottles, for example, that we throw away? And then if we want to recycle them, we crush them up, we remelt it, and we produce new recycled glass bottles. Now that takes a lot of energy to do that. If we can reuse the bottles by cleaning them out and refilling them, that's a better solution in many ways, because you're using less energy. But if we can't do that, then we can recycle the glass, and glass is infinitely recyclable. So is aluminium cans, it's lightweight and it's infinitely recyclable. There are other materials, many of the plastics, they get mixed up, and particularly when we're thinking about product design and recycling, if we weld different materials together, different types of plastic together, as we see in toothbrushes and all sorts of things, there's two different types of plastics welded together, they're inseparable. If we put that into the recycling, then it degrades the recycled polymer. If we can have standards where it's one type of material, then that becomes much more recyclable over the long term. So there's different factors involved in recycling. But I mean, the main message, I think, really is to eliminate as much excess packaging and waste as we can, and then to recycle the stuff that we have to. But put limits on all this disposable use of materials, because these are very precious materials. You know, a few years ago, I visited I used to live in Canada, and I visited the largest pulp mill in Canada at the time. It's since closed down, but it was a wood pulp mill at a place called Powell River on the British Columbian coast, and they brought all these trees down in the sea with tugboats to this recycling, this paper mill, and these huge trees were put through the saw and then through the chipper, and they turned them into pulp, these massive, massive trees. And I went through the whole process where they were cleaning it and chipping it and turning it into paper, and out of the end came these huge rolls of newsprint. So these trees at the one end of the process, massive trees that had taken hundreds of years to grow, turned up at the other end with these rolls of newsprint. And when I got home, through the letterbox came all this junk mail made out of newsprint, and I picked it up and I put it in the bin. So that was what happened and so many people do that. You know, all these trees get felled, they go through all this process with all this pollution, use of chemicals, use of energy, pollution going up, global warming, and it gets printed with toxic inks, it comes through the letterbox, and you pick it up and you put it in the bin. And that's what we are doing with precious human resources. I mean, we should not be doing this. This should be illegal. And it's the same with plastics and hydrocarbons. These are precious resources which we are wasting. We had the North Sea in Britain, North Sea hydrocarbons, and if with moderate use, we would have had energy resources to last generations, and it's basically been used in a generation. These oil reserves, it's been used we're now importing gas from Russia because we've used all these resources in such a short time. There's no sense of moderation. And so we're burning lots of coal, we're using precious hydrocarbons. We need to think that there are limits to this stuff. It's a precious resource and we need to use them wisely, not as fast as possible. I used to work in the oil industry, and I remember being on an exploration well in the west of Oman, next to Saudi Arabia, and we drilled this well, and we didn't know if there was going to be oil there or not. As it turned out, it was producing about 400 barrels a day on a drill stem test, and the production station was about 20 miles away. And it was going to take some weeks to get the pipeline to the well from the production station to start producing the well. The night we did the drill stem test, and it tested at 400 barrels a day, there was a line of trucks at the well to truck the oil from the wellhead to the production station. And I said, well, it's been in the ground for 1 million years or more. What's the big rush? You know, a couple of weeks till we get the pipeline there. And it was all based on economics. If you produce it today rather than in 4 weeks' time, it's worth so much more money. So it's all driven not by moderate use, that this is a precious resource that can last generations. It's all driven by today's profit. And that's the priority. That's the economic monoculture that Michaels talks about. It's not driven by need. It's not driven by wisdom. It's not driven by moderation and consideration of future generations. It's driven by today's profits. And that's what we'll need to turn around. That's contemporary capitalism, but it's destroying the planet. In many ways it brings us many, many benefits, but without constraint, without moderation, we're just destroying the planet. And this is, you know, we've only got one, and this is where we live, so we ought to look after it.
Mais alguma pergunta? Algum comentário? Mas eu acho que é melhor você vir aqui, por favor. E nem falar assim, não.
My name is Fabio. I was invited from my coordinator, Edição. I studied a little about the triple bottom line from John Elton, and I didn't understand the correct meaning of the credible bottom line that you formed. It's a new concept that amplifies the triple bottom line, or what is the relation?
It's a good question. I'll try and clarify. The difference. The question is the difference between the triple bottom line and the quadruple bottom line. The triple bottom line prioritizes environmental issues, economic issues, and social issues. And the quadruple bottom line is framed in terms of human meaning, and it's based on 3 levels of human meaning from John Hick's work, which is a theological philosopher, based on different levels of human meaning and how we find meaning in the world. So it's not necessarily based on the immediate issues, it's based on how we find meaning. And as I said earlier on, in modernity, there's been this hole at the center of modern society, which is about meaningfulness, and we've lost this sense of meaning. So, practical meaning refers to what we do in the world in terms of practical activities and how we find them meaningful. What does a meaningful action mean, if you like? How do we define a meaningful action? And it goes like this. Is reading a book a meaningful activity? Now you could say, yes, that's a pretty meaningful activity. Reading a book is a meaningful activity. But it depends on context. Because if you are trying to cross the highway, reading a book is not a meaningful activity, okay? Because you're not appropriately interpreting the environment around you and acting accordingly. So, a meaningful practical activity is an activity which takes into consideration your context and your environment and acts accordingly. Acts in a way which is appropriate to that context. Okay? So, reading a book, if you're sitting in your living room, reading a book with a cup of coffee is a meaningful activity, perhaps. When you're crossing the highway, looking around is a meaningful activity. That's what you need to be doing if you're crossing the highway, right? Not reading a book. Now, when you take into consideration environmental issues and so on, related to our practical activities, our production, right? Back in 1900 maybe, mass production looked like a great idea because everybody could benefit from these technological products, right? So it was a meaningful activity. Everybody could benefit from having a bicycle or a motor car or a radio or a vacuum cleaner, and it was seen as a human benefit. So meaningful activity would be to provide as many people as possible with these products, because it was easing the burden of human labor. 100 years later, we know that when everybody has those types of products, the environment suffers. So we have a new context. We have a new context which is different from 1900. We've been producing them for 100 years or more. We've expanded the production, many, many, many tens of times. And we're seeing negative feedback, if you like, that the environment is breaking down because of these activities. So a meaningful activity today is not to continue that. Because if we were just to continue, we wouldn't be acting appropriately to the context in which we now find ourselves. So we have to respond to the context and act appropriately in order for that activity to be meaningful. So to continue is not a meaningful thing to do. So we have to respond differently for that activity to be meaningful today. And so we can go on to social meaning. That's practical meaning with its environmental consequences. Social meaning is, what does it mean to be an individual who lives in community with other people? How do I need to act in relation not to the environment, but in relation to other people? Where do we get those teachings from? Well, traditionally, it's from philosophy and from religion. How we should respond to and act with other people. So compassion, consideration of the other, charity, these kinds of things, ethics, they kick in the social aspects, right? And then there's personal meaning. How do I find meaning in my life as an individual, which we all have to ask ourselves as individuals? Where do I find meaning in my life? Is it through buying more stuff? Is it through luxury holidays? Is it through something deeper and more profound? Where do I get that meaning from? And again, traditionally, that came from religion and philosophy and ideas about contemplation and reflection and self-interrogation, the examined life of Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living, which is what Socrates said. So it's all about this sort of sense of inner purpose, inner values, and that's what the personal meaning means. So personal meaning, social meaning, and practical meaning, and the way to behave in the world and the way to do activities in the world, we use this thing we call currency, which allows us to exchange goods and services. But unfortunately, it's the accumulation of the currency which has become a major priority in modern society. It was never meant to be that. It was meant to be an exchange, a bill of exchange, so we could exchange that for that. That's all it was meant to be. But now it's become an end in itself. So by putting the economic issues on equal terms with the other two in the triple bottom line, like my view, it's the wrong prioritization. We need practical meaning, personal meaning, and social meaning. They are the three levels of human meaning, and the fourth one is economic means. So while it might look similar, it's rather different in terms of its positioning. And it's related to traditional understandings of human meaning. John Hick's three levels of meaning: natural meaning, religious meaning, and social meaning, or ethical. Natural meaning, ethical meaning, and religious meaning is Hick's. And it also relates to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have physiological needs, needs for love and belonging, and then the higher self-realization needs at the top. So you can divide that pyramid, there's about 7 different grades in it, but you can divide it into 3 basic levels which relate to practical meaning, social meaning and individual meaning. Okay.
Mais alguém tem alguma questão ou colocação, comentário? Por favor, você pode vir aqui.
The word leapfrog. And my master's thesis focused on how Brazil could do an economic or engage in economic leapfrog by moving to the circular economy, particularly looking at electronic waste and national policy on solid waste. And there are quite a lot of opportunities for that to happen here. There's an eco-industrial park in Rio, which is a private sector initiative, not a public sector initiative, which originally was. But considering the 2 choices that we said, one, go down the very Anglo-Saxon economic model, which produces a lot of waste, or go down perhaps a model that's based on more design thinking. What do you think is the biggest driver or argument or policy mechanism for, in particular, what area for a country to actually make that choice? Because the arguments are there, but countries aren't actually implementing it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good question.
For Brazil, which could, I think it's a beautiful opportunity to completely, do away with an old model. But what will make a government do it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a very difficult question. I'm by no means minimizing the challenges, because there's a lot of incentives to move in the other direction and to embrace Western-style capitalism. But there are voices in developing countries coming out of Islamic academics in Malaysia and from Buddhism in the Far East, and many developing economies which are saying we cannot go the Western-style capitalism because it needs to be rethought, and we need to develop new priorities. And while it brings many, many benefits, the costs are huge. But in a developing economy, there are lots of incentives and pressures externally to become part of free markets, free market economies, which often serve the interests of major corporations rather than ordinary people, unfortunately. They maximize profits for corporations, and responsibilities are dispersed, and you can't put your finger on anything very often when everything's globalized. But I think the evidence is that the richest economies in the world were developed not through free market economics. They were not developed through free market economics. Britain became a very rich nation not through free market economics. America became a very rich nation not through free market economics. So there were other agendas at that time which allowed those countries to become rich in those times. Free market economics and opening up markets suits certain agendas, and there are pressures to go that route. There are pressures put on governments to go that route, but I think we have to challenge that and question that and not take it as automatically good. We have to look at what that's going to actually do for ordinary people and see what the record of that is, where free market economics have been implemented, and see if those promises about more jobs, about raising the level of income for ordinary people, see if they actually happened. Because I think the evidence is not clear that it does that by any means. So I think we need to challenge those things. And there's a lot of pressure to go down those kinds of routes, because there's a lot of resources in Brazil which are useful to the rest of the world, right? Exactly. To be exploited. I mean, the very word resources is an interesting term, because what we're talking about is the natural environment, but we call it resources. To be exploited. There was a news item on NPR this morning, as I was getting ready to come into the university, about China's space program.
Yes.
You heard that? And they're seeing the moon.
Project with Brazil.
Right. Well, they're seeing the moon as a resource base. So, I mean, who gives permission to exploit the... Who owns the moon to be able to go and see that as a quarry site? To destroy the moon for human benefit. You know, that's the way we look at it. We look at it as a resource base. We look at the natural environment as a resource to be exploited. And that fundamental outlook has to change. Yes, we need to use the materials and the products of the earth to sustain human life, but not at any cost, and not simply for growing profits, which is the main driver. There has to be other priorities. Those priorities have to be others. Of course, a business has to generate profit to stay in business. But what is a reasonable profit and what is an unreasonable profit? There is no sense of sufficiency in Western style capitalism. There's no such thing as enough. It's just exponential growth. Exponential growth. Well, you can't have exponential growth on a finite planet. You know, the physics don't support that. You know, it's
because there is a long distance between these profits and the greed of hegemonic corporations. That's the point.
Yeah.
And that's a very serious question for design.
Yeah. I mean, modern corporations, as I understand it, their mandate is to maximize shareholder profit. That's what they are incorporated for, to maximize shareholder profit. And anything that interferes with profit maximization is externalized. It's pushed out of their responsibility. I mean, this is Milton Friedman economics, as I understand it, that maximize shareholder profit. So, social responsibility, not my problem. Environmental responsibility, not my problem. We are here to maximize shareholder profit, and we will do that. And that's what their mandate is. You know, and then British government, for example, they've hauled some of these corporations over the coals in public debates to shame them into paying taxes because they've been avoiding taxes because they're offshore. And the corporations say, well, that's the law. We've done nothing outside the law. Our mandate is to maximize shareholder profit. We do it by going offshore in a perfectly legal operation. It's allowed, and we're maximizing shareholder profit. So all your shouting and shaming is not going to really affect us because we're doing what we're mandated to do. Because that's what, and that's the law. So they are legally obliged to maximize shareholder profit. So we can't blame corporations for doing what they're mandated to do. What we can do is reach international agreements which change what they're mandated to do. And if that's what they're mandated to do, they'll start to do that.
Because the EU recently, last year, December, released a manifesto for circular economy in the EU, and to be honest, I haven't really followed up on that. But that seems to me that the EU has an understanding of resource efficiency and effectiveness. So do you think it's a policy angle that needs to tackle this thing?
Well, you know, as I was saying earlier before the talk, resource efficiency, maximization of efficiency, and resource intensification in products is all very well, and it can help a little bit, but if the general trajectory is exponential growth, no matter how much we improve efficiency and resource intensity in those products, the general trend is still exponential growth. The key is reduction in consumption, and that doesn't go down too well. That doesn't go down too well. Because no matter how much more efficient we make things, no matter how much smarter we are in research materials, if the general trend is exponential growth, it will make some difference, but overall, there's no evidence that the trends are making any significant inroads into climate changing gases and so on.
Mais alguma pergunta ou algum comentário?
There's one at the back here.
Por favor, venha aqui na frente, por gentileza. A lista já circulou com todos vocês para assinar e colocar em seus e-mails? Onde que está a lista? Todo mundo pode assinar e-mail.
In front of the camera, I suppose, yeah.
My name is José Favila, I'm from Textiles. Okay. I have two questions. The first one, I think it's an easy one, is why you use flex in your chess set. The second one is the same discussion that our colleague is putting for you. If the world is going to 40 to 50% of poor people, and these poor people will need more consumption, how we can balance the lower consumption of consumerism? Because you have consumerism for other needs than sufficient to survive. And I would like to say your opinion about that.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, I'm not a textile designer. I used flax and linseed oil to cover the wood because I understood it to be a natural material which is renewable, which is traditional, and so I chose that material as a way to differentiate the two sides. I also covered I finished the pieces with linseed oil, which is from the same plant, because it produces a hard finish to protect the wood from fingerprints and so on. That was the reason. Okay, that was the reason I used that, because it's natural material. And then the second question was about consumption by poor people. Yeah, that's a good question, because there is a need for the poorest in the world to consume a little bit more, so that they have decent standards of living. But the most excessive waste and energy use is among the richest nations, not among the poorest nations. Right? Australia, I think, is the highest in terms of climate emissions because of the suburban lifestyles, very high consumption levels, air conditioning units, swimming pools, all this, big cars. So the biggest environmental fallout, if you like, is from the richest nations in relation to consumption. Yes, there's a need for the poorest people to increase their consumption a little bit, but there's also a need for the excessive consumption and the replacement of consumer goods on such a regular basis to be reduced and moderated, to bring that down in the richest nations. Because if everybody in the world aspired to those levels of consumption, we just can't sustain that. That's totally unsustainable. So I showed you a picture from Peter Menzel's book about typical consumption of a typical United States household with all these goods. I mean, it's by any standards immoderate, and we don't really need all that stuff. But it's not just the amount of stuff, it's the constant replacement of stuff. So that, every 6 months there's a new mobile phone to buy. Every year there's a new tablet to buy. And so the old ones get thrown out and replaced. And this is partly, it's not because they necessarily offer such, so much more functionality. It becomes the number on the product. It's a positional good, right? So very subtle aesthetic changes in the form and a different number on the product turns it into a positional product, where you're not buying it so much for the functionality, you're buying it because it's the latest one. And then these things are related to these addiction-like qualities, where we're not thinking anymore, we're just entertaining ourselves and totally distracted. So when the next one comes out, automatically we think, oh, I got to get the new one, because this is now old. I need the new one, because I'm being told I need the new one. And this constantly feeds this consumption frenzy, which is not making us any happier, and in the process is destroying the planet and creating all this waste. So yes, I agree with you that the poorest in the world need to have better living standards from a material point of view, to give them basic living. But a large majority of people in the developed world, in the middle classes and higher, have high consumption levels which are excessive in terms of materials, energy, pollution, waste and all the rest of it. And those need to be moderated, and we need to fill that void created by lower consumption with longer lasting products and with a different set of priorities and values, where the latest model or the biggest four-wheel drive is looked upon with social derision. Like, you know, smoking used to be cool. In many countries now, smoking is no longer cool. You're a social pariah in many countries, in New York, for example. If you smoke, you're excluded and looked upon as a social pariah. Well, if we look upon the person with the biggest four-wheel drive or the latest gadget as sort of socially irresponsible, which is the point we need to get to, right? Where that's seen as a socially irresponsible thing to do. And there's social caveat seen in an old battered PC with some, you know, duct tape around it to keep it together, and you've had it a long time, a laptop for life, or a mobile phone for life that can be continually upgraded in terms of technology, then if that's seen as socially responsible, and you get your sort of social status, if you like, by the older things, the older your electronic products are, and the older your car is, then we've changed the priority system, right? But that's a long way off, right? Yeah.
Obrigada. Tem uma questão?
Na verdade, não é uma questão, são alguns comentários, algumas anotações que eu fiz. Bem, I was speaking Russian because it's difficult to repeat in English and speak in
That's fine,
English, and
absolutely.
I will ask her to translate for me.
That's fine.
Tá, então, bom dia, gente, meu nome é Yumna, eu faço gestão de políticas públicas, então o meu pensamento é um pouquinho diferente de design e tal, eu vou tentar fazer, eu fiz algumas pontuações das perguntas que tiveram, das respostas também do, né, uma questão que surgiu foi em relação a mudanças e como que, por exemplo, é viável fazer um design sustentável no sistema econômico como a gente vive hoje.
Espera um pouquinho, tem que falar, né?
She's
from public policy. She works on
Public policies management.
Yes, and she's a USP student, undergraduate student on policy management,
Right.
public policy management.
Okay.
And she is wondering about the role of design, papel do design.
Yeah, actually, let me try. I want to do some punctuations about what the asking people were doing and your answers, but not really a question, just a few.
Just a comment.
Sim, algumas provocações.
Fala em inglês, você vai.
É muito difícil
Não,
pensar,
eu vou te ajudar.
vocês me ajudam. Então, ó, e daí a gente pensou, assim, a gente estuda muito gestão de políticas públicas, que existem diversos atores para os problemas. E assim, os principais é a sociedade civil, as empresas e o governo. Então, o governo...
Então, she's considered that from the public policy management, there are some actors involved in the process. Government, civil society and companies.
E que mesmo que as taxações da parte governamental, então o seu governo, ele pensando no meio ambiente, ele faça algumas políticas de prevenção, políticas que obriguem as empresas a terem um produto mais sustentável.
If government develop policies that will encourage companies to develop sustainable products.
Sim, não depende simplesmente de um país, né? Do Brasil, por exemplo, uma coisa que pode acontecer muito, deixa só, daí você vê que você então,
It does not depend only in one country. It's not dependent only on one country. rights.
E uma questão que ele falou assim, mas os direitos trabalhistas conquistados aqui no Brasil ponto negativo é que hoje a gente não consegue ser competitivo com a China.
So she said that from the perspective of working rights in Brazil, we are not so competitive such as China, due to the difference in working rights in these two countries.
E um aspecto que ele não considerou é que um problema muito grande na China é o trabalho escravo. Então,
so in China, we needed to consider also slave work.
Então ele considerou diminuir os direitos trabalhistas no Brasil para que seja competitivo com a China. Então assim, um problema é o quanto que a gente está taxando as empresas, elas não tirariam capital do Brasil para ir para outro país onde elas pudessem ter, por exemplo, o que acontece, né? Onde elas podem poluir mais, onde elas podem utilizar produtos químicos, onde aqui não é permitido, fugindo dessa taxação. Por isso que eu acredito que tem que ser uma mudança global.
She said there has to be a global change because taxation sometimes can prevent one country of having environmental problems, but we are pushing these environmental problems towards another country, such as, for example, China, and also she commented about the slave work in that country.
Tá? E
this is just a comment that she would like to listen to. Tem mais alguma coisinha?
sim, só mudando eu vejo que a mudança ela vem primeiro do indivíduo, depois da sociedade, mas tem que ser global. Individualmente a gente consegue fazer mudanças, mas tem que ser uma coisa pensada globalmente, porque...
Deixa eu falar isso para ela. She thinks that first this change has to be from the individual scale, then to go to global scale.
Então eu acho que o grande desafio é como a gente consegue mudar os valores, né? Uma sociedade consumista.
The stronger challenge is how to change values.
E onde hoje a gente prefere descobrir novos planetas para explorar os recursos ao invés de repensar a forma como a gente vive, né? E abrindo mão de algumas conquistas do plano material.
So nowadays it's easier to think about to discover new planets, to exploit resources, than to change.
To think new ways to live and abrir mão de algumas conquistas no plano material.
And then to change our material way of living.
E daí isso bate uma outra questão para finalizar, que é pensar a gente essa transição da sociedade, né? Da sociedade coletiva, onde o coletivo sacrificava alguns prazeres individuais pelo bem maior, e hoje onde a gente vive uma sociedade que é individualizada, onde o indivíduo, nossos prazeres e vontades individuais, elas são maiores do que o bem coletivo. Então a gente repensar essa sociedade é uma coisa que a gente discute muito em ciências políticas.
So she said that they discuss a lot the relationship between collective sense of well-being and individual sense of well-being, and this is her concern, how to work from these two perspectives, from an ego to the collective.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to respond?
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I think there's many issues you've raised there. I don't think we can deal effectively at the global level from the start. We have to start in our own context and deal with the boundaries that we can deal within and change within our own context. But at the same time, we are members of a global community today, and the French philosopher Gortz made the point in his book Ecologica that we may have developed through the globalized technology the instrument of the demise of Western capitalism through the hacker, right? Because the hacker is undermining many of those areas of priority of Western-style capitalism and global corporations, partly through revelation of information. So we wouldn't know without the internet that Foxconn, which makes many of the mobile phones and PCs that we use, had 16 suicides last year because of the working conditions, because of the slave conditions. And the response from the Foxconn Corporation was they were throwing themselves off the building to commit suicide because they just couldn't take it anymore. And the response of Foxconn was to put catch nets around the building so that they didn't kill themselves. Since then, they have improved working conditions somewhat, but their initial response was to put catch nets around to stop people killing themselves, which is not necessarily the most appropriate response. But through the internet, we are actually having revealed to us these ideas about slave labor, the collapse of the building in Bangladesh, where all those people got killed in a factory system under virtually slave conditions. International immediate global communications are allowing us to see these things. And so when it comes back to our individual conscience and our individual priorities, if we know certain companies are producing goods under those kinds of production means, whether it's fast fashion, are we willing to buy a $5 t-shirt from basically produced by slave labor, or should we be paying $25 for decent working conditions? Do we know that $25 t-shirt is not produced by slave labor? Well, we can do some checking. It's difficult because you can't check out every product that you buy, but we do have some means to do that, and those revelations are putting pressure on companies, often Western companies, who are producing these goods in factories in developing countries, putting pressure on them to monitor and keep better track on and improve. Now, when you take that to its conclusion, we can make a mobile phone virtually disposable, or a PC or a laptop or a tablet virtually disposable, because we can make it so cheap to buy and replace. Why? Because we're using slave labor in developing countries. If, through those revelations, we improve the working conditions, we pay people a living wage, we employ more people so that people have lower working shifts, then the cost of production goes up. When the cost of production goes up, the cost of retail goes up. So if you're paying $1,000 for a mobile phone rather than $100 for a mobile phone, because it reflects the true cost. If the true cost of the phone is the environmental impact and the social impact, and those things are included in the price of the product, we are not going to throw it away and replace it so easily if it's $1,000. So we will keep it longer. We will expect it to be repairable. We will expect it to be upgradable. It's only because we produce using slave labor and these kinds of automated production processes. It keeps the cost down, but it makes people, it lays people off. People don't have work. And if we think about industry, not just in terms of producing the cheapest product possible, but as providing useful work to people, that's part of their responsibility. If we think about the more people we employ, the better, not the fewer people we employ, the better, because we're giving people productive, useful work with good conditions as a social good, then we change the priority system. Now, when we talk about global production and local production, at the local level, we can keep track. We can see what the conditions are, we can see what the environmental impacts are if we're taking resources locally. If it's somewhere on the other side of the world, we have no clue. Besides which, we probably don't care as much as much as if they were our own people, in our own community or our own society. And if we live in the place where the resources are coming from, then we care about that natural environment. If those resources are coming from somewhere else, it's not our problem. It's somebody else's problem. And so Yes, you can, the old adage, we can think, you know, global, but we act local. Schumacher's policy, small is beautiful. You start a company or a cooperation, a cooperative, which was his approach, and you grow it to a certain size. When it comes over a certain size, you break off and you start another one. You don't just make it bigger and bigger and bigger, because you lose touch with people. After about 200 people, you lose touch. And so you start another one. And a good example of that is the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain. I don't know if you're familiar with those. The cooperative movement was started, the cooperative principles were written in the 19th century by some thinkers, social thinkers in the north of England. They were the cooperative principles, and you can find them on the internet. Those principles were adopted by a priest in Mondragon in the 1950s, who was a teacher at a technical school for boys. And when they finished the technical training, they had no jobs to go to. So he started a small cooperative in Mondragon. It's a town in the Basque country of Spain, northern Spain. He started a small cooperative producing paraffin heaters, kerosene home heaters. From that, he's developed a host of cooperatives, a cooperative model where the lowest paid and the highest paid are bracketed. It's not the lowest paid get paid minimum wage and the executives get paid astronomical. There's a difference of 20 to 1, I think. It's limited. And they have cooperative production of white goods, so washing machines and cookers and that kind of stuff. Cooperative university, a cooperative technical university, where the students spend so many days in the factory and so many days at university. Cooperative banking, cooperative housing, cooperative schooling, cooperative transportation. Everything is done on a cooperative basis, and it's been very successful. One of the most successful businesses in Spain, and it's been exported all over the world. So the cooperative model can work, but fundamental to the cooperative model is social responsibility, social equity. It's not the rich executives take all the bonuses and all the shares. The ordinary factory workers are on the board, they share responsibility, they share decisions, and the lowest paid and the highest paid is within a certain reasonable bracket. It's not just the bosses taking all the profits. So it's a different economic model, and it's the one that Schumacher recommended in his book Small is Beautiful back in the 70s. So there are different approaches to enterprise which are more moderate, more socially responsible and more environmentally responsible. So when it comes to policy making, there are models out there which can influence policy, which can help drive policy, and which can challenge some of the assumptions about Western-style capitalism, which need to be challenged today, I would say.
Eu queria pedir novamente aplauso para o professor.
Thank you.